For the first time in about 8 years, liberal pollsters like Quinnipiac and others have Donald Trump winning important states like Michigan and Wisconsin, and we need to look into why he's up massively in these liberal biased polls. So let's start with the Quinnipiac Rust Belt results. So first and foremost, they have Trump winning Wisconsin by 2. They have Michigan going to Trump by 3, but they also have Pennsylvania, despite the typo from Radical Politics. Okay, he's got to get it together. But listen, PA is importantly noted as being Harris plus 3. Now, there's a reason why, right? This is what my channel exists for, is to point out the niche reasons as to why there's a discordance when there ought to be a higher correlation with how the output ought to be for these surveys that are done. Right, so millions of dollars are put into these things, and yet they're still kind of variant, and which doesn't really make sense. If we look at 2020, for instance, you'll notice that these three states were within a few points of each other. You saw that Biden won Pennsylvania by a little bit, and won Michigan by a little more, but they were all relatively close. So, like I said, 1.2 here, 2.8 here, and zero point 0.6 here. So, less than 2.5 percentage points in difference. So, if anything, this just proves that these two Republican outcomes are actually better and kind of proves PA to be an outlier with Quinnipiac. But it also shows that Quinnipiac and other liberal polls are just illogical in the way they're made. And there's going to be some data I'm going to prove it with. Yet another indication that even though, again, the polls that are kind of like newly for Trump that are of the liberal persuasion, despite them being kind of crazy, like for instance, like I said, Pennsylvania being 3 points for Kamala, yet Michigan going for Trump by a few points. That doesn't really make sense. But what it does show is a directionality that has a correlation with being positive news for the former president. In fact, we look at this day in history, October 10th of 2020. In 2016 as well, you'll notice that the polls now are tighter and more positive to Donald Trump than they were, in the case of Biden's election or in the case of Clinton against Trump in 16. So we're just going to go over some examples. So nationally, Harris is up over Trump in the Real Clear Politics aggregation of all the polls by about 2 percentage points, which you might think to yourself, well, that's a popular vote victory for Kamala, but that's not going to cut it to win the election. In fact, let me remind you of 2016, where Trump won handsomely in the Electoral College. Well, Hillary won the popular vote by a little over 2 percentage points, which is to say, Harris being up by 2 now is not going to cut it when it matters. Though, you look at 2020, they had Biden winning nationally by 10 percentage points as of October, a few weeks before the election. Now, this is absurd. It's an absurdist claim to make. Even then, I knew it was going to be closer than that, and they were off, by like 5.5 percentage points at the end of the day. But you can see where the bias is. 2016, that had Clinton up by 5.8. So in 2016, they were wrong. In 2020, they doubled down. They were more wrong. And then in 2024, I think they've yet to correct the problem. But what it does show is that these liberal pollsters are so inundated with Republican support, is my assumption, that even if they're slanted, they're still going to have to, be dragged along a little bit more. And what I mean is that, with their hokey numbers, they could have had a Clinton by 6. They could have had a Biden plus 10. But now they can only make up a Harris plus 2. But in reality, it's probably more like Trump plus 2 than anything. So I say all this to point out that obviously, while the polls are not accurate still, even if they have Trump winning of the liberal persuasion, like I mentioned before, it still shows that it's still, dragging more in the Trump direction. And it's a hard thing to really explain and to put into words, but you viscerally feel it. When you feel like the former president's going to win, this is part of the reason why. Alrighty, so let's now consult the top battlegrounds. There's 7 of them exactly, okay? We have Arizona, we have Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Now, keep in mind a few things. Well, Trump is leading Kamala Harris right now, 48.4% to Kamala Harris's 48.1. This is interesting for a few reasons, okay? Well, chief among them is that Trump is leading all around by a third of a percentage point, which might not be that impressive, but also keep in mind, truly, that he's only been up by like 0.02 at most ever in this election that I recall. And so this is the biggest lead he's had. And again, it's a small sliver. There's a margin of error of, let's say, 2 to 4 percentage points. That's all true. But again, there's a directionality. And that's important because the clock is about to run out. We have less than a month until the election. If it's pointing more towards Trump in an election where we, and by we I mean most of my audience, and I personally believe Trump will win, if it's getting a little more favorable to Donald Trump when he's already in the lead, then you could see how it's really analogous with a huge lead being sustained. And so we do have each state break down. And so look at this. So the broken down results for Arizona is that Trump's leading it by 0.9, which I think is a conservative estimate. I think Trump is going to easily win my state. Then also Nevada, you see that Harris is winning by 1, which is interesting because again, Nevada is less conservative than is Arizona, in my opinion, and historically, just partisan wise, is less Republican. Though things are liable to change, obviously, and obviously, you have policies like no tax on tips and everything like that. Now, Kamala copied it, so maybe that's the cope for Democrats that are voting Kamala still, but that's still a factor. Wisconsin, again, Harris is winning by point 0.4. Now, Wisconsin is notorious for polling inaccurately when it comes to sampling Republican support, namely Donald Trump's. Okay, again, how many times do I have to bring this up? ABC News, within weeks of the election in 2020, had Biden beating Trump by 17 points. They were only off, by the way, by about maybe 16 percentage points in Wisconsin. It's ridiculous. And so to take the polls at face value in Wisconsin is asinine, unless Trump's winning, in which case they're right, but margin wise, they're totally wrong. And you know what? That's another thing. A lot of liberals will say, well, we were right in 2020. And it's like, no, you weren't. They're begging your ignorance. Why? Because when they say they're right, they're saying like, oh, well, Biden won Michigan. I predicted Michigan going for Biden. Okay, but let's just take it at face value. Let's say Biden won Michigan by 2.5 percentage points. Okay, people like Nate Silver, these types are like, oh yeah, Biden's gonna win by 8. It's like, dude, you were off by 6. Had you had Trump winning by 1%, you'd be closer than if you were to say Biden would win by 8 in the state of Michigan, for example. And so that's what they're writing off. That's why they're still getting funding, by the way, even though they were wrong 2 times in a row. Because, like, well, technically the Democrat won. And it's like, well, bro, the margins were way off if you take them at face value to begin with. And so it's an aside, but it's a powerful aside. Anyways, Michigan. Michigan, the state I was born in, you look at this, Trump is up by zero point 0.7. Now, this is really good, as Michigan typically, out of these 7 states, ought to be the most liberal traditionally. I mean, it was the closest state to a Hillary win in 2016. It was the strongest state out of the 3 Rust Belt states, which is Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And that was the strongest one for Biden in 2020. And so, obviously, for Trump to be winning, this is pretty impressive. But what it also shows is a discordance between, and I don't know if that's even a word, by the way. I'm like, oh, I'm so smart. But anyway, Michigan ought to be more liberal than Wisconsin, and it has been the past 2 elections. And so either Michigan isn't as Republican as it's being polled, which I doubt because the polls are liberal, or is it that Wisconsin polling is so shite that it's off and it's actually probably like R plus 3. R plus 3 meaning in this case Republican plus 3. Anyway, so Michigan being Trump victory by zero point 0.7 is fantastic news, as that probably means that Trump is up by like 2 or 3 in real life. But Pennsylvania also Trump plus zero point 0.3. This is really inaccurate. I was recently, and by recently I mean a few weeks ago, I was in Philadelphia for some political stuff, and I saw all the behind the scenes numbers, things that only nerds would like, stuff that we really, 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 really enjoy. It's like Pokemon cards. We're collecting all these voter registrations and everything, but Pennsylvania numbers are looking rock solid for the former president. I mean, you look at the state, right? Trump lost it purportedly by 1.2 percentage points against Scranton Joe. You think Kamala Harris, cackling Kamala, is going to get those voters back? And what are those voters? I'm talking about the people that voted for Trump in 16, but then went to Biden in 2020. Yes, those people. Shame on you guys if you're watching. But anyway, the point being is that, some of those people, again, voted Democrat last election. Do you think those people are more likely to vote for Trump like they did in 16, or are they going to go Kamala like they did Biden in 20? See, Kamala isn't Joe Biden, insinuates cackle. That's a trope with Kamala. It's like, I'm not Joe Biden. But anyway, people are not going to like Kamala in Pennsylvania. For it to be a Trump victory at all is pretty impressive because, again, the polls are so left that to be up at all is actually pretty cool. Though I will tell you that, again, it's probably a way better margin than what's being reported. North Carolina, Trump up by zero point 0.6. North Carolina is a very crazy state, as obviously, you have Trump winning it, by 1.3. And keep in mind that in 2020, he lost all the other 7 swing states, or I guess 6 other ones, versus North Carolina, which actually stayed Republican. But anyway, the point being is that, for him to be up by zero point 0.6 is really tricky because on one hand, the Pennsylvania logic applies that, he should do better. That being said, keep in mind also that North Carolina is interesting because there's the whole Hurricane Helene situation, which might make the turnout for conservative rural parts of North Carolina to make it be depressed. And so you don't know if that's going to negatively impact Republicans, because on the other hand, you could say the rest of the state that can vote about as effectively as they otherwise would in a normal circumstance are probably going to be more inclined to vote for Trump, given the lack of a response that's adequate by the incumbent administration. So it works both ways, and so we got to wait a little longer to see how this plays out. As again, there's weeks for this to really play out. Georgia, on the other hand, is Trump plus zero point 0.8. Okay. Now, again, this is a pretty good result, as the Georgia polls are, for whatever reason, the most accurate out of the 7 swing states historically. I don't know why that is, but it just is the case. Georgia being up by zero point 0.8 is pretty good, as again, people, Democrats, shills have been saying, oh, Georgia, North Carolina, these are going to be blue states because of the black population. And it's like, well, then why don't you live it up in Detroit then? Plenty of black people there. Philadelphia, I mean, come on. Anyway, the point being is that, like, Kamala's supposed to have this particular appeal, and it's just not going to land. And you could see this. And, Biden won it on a fluke, if you can even call it that. And so, for that reason, obviously, I think Trump is doing better than zero point 0.8, but this is a pretty solid Republican win, if true. And so, with that being said, there are, again, 7 swing states, and Trump is winning 5 out of the 7. Those being Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia. And that's really good because, again, if he were to win these, he wins the election. If he takes Arizona, if he takes Pennsylvania, he takes North Carolina, he takes Georgia, he wins. And then Michigan is just tertiary. That just adds to it. That would be somewhere approximating a 290 electoral win, something like that. So that is the update. So with that being said, liberal pollsters are having Donald Trump winning for the first time in my lifetime, and it's so great to see. Again, 25 days until the election on November 5th, and 25 days until we can see CNN break down yet again. Oh my God, let's get right into it. And like the video if you haven't liked it yet. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Comment down below if you have anything to say, and I'll read it soon. And I got a new laptop, so expect more regular uploads coming down the pike. See y'all in the next one. Adios.